You're in a revitalization. Yeah, like 95% of you leaders are. And you're struggling to find out what the next steps are. You're wondering, what kind of leadership can you provide? And where do you get direction from that leadership? Well, today on Revitalize and Replant, Mark Clifton, the International Harvester hat, and Thom Rainer, the dude.
Without a hat?
Without a hat. I need to start wearing my Church Answers hat.
You do.
You inspire me.
You do.
I need to put that on. I love our Church Answers hat. We're going to talk about something that I think could be very useful in a revitalization, not only to know what direction to go, but to win some people over. And that is this: start talking to some longer term members and get them to tell you and respond to certain questions. You ever done that, Mark?
I have. And we always say around here, actually, it was Henry Blackaby who told me this 30 years ago, probably. The remaining members of a church are not an obstacle to your ministry. They are your first ministry. And I think sometimes guys go into a replant or revitalization and they think, look at these older folks here. They're the obstacle. I got to work around them. I got to work over them. I got to kick them to the side of the road. I got to do something. No, you got to start with them. And I think that's what we're going to talk about here in just a minute. You begin with the ones you have right there. And you begin by listening to them.
Let me go down real quickly the Rainer son checklist. Rainer's son, Art, middle son, he's in Christian finance. He has started a company called Christian Money Solutions, and I'm very proud of him. And so that's middle son. Younger son, Jess, started a church. The church is at Spring Hill, Tennessee. So he ingeniously named the church at Spring Hill. So that's the name of the church. And he has done a very good job of starting a church. Started about 6-7 years ago, has about 200 in worship attendance, and is just steadily in good health. Not a big church, but not a small church, done well. Then there's son Sam, the oldest of the three, works with me regularly at Church Answers, but also has always been, and I think this is his sixth church, but he's been there. He's in year number 8 at Sixth Church. He has always been in a church revitalization. He's at West Bradenton Church in Florida. And I asked him early on, what was the first thing you did when you got to West Bradenton? And it may not have been the first, but it was one of the first, Mark. He started interviewing informally, having meetings with, there were still a few of the charter members there, founder members. There were plenty of members there who had been there a long time. And he wanted to find out what they knew, what their dreams and their aspirations were. I think that did more for his ministry to get it on the right foot than anything else he did.
Just listening to them, right?
Just listening to them.
There have been an occasion in my life, once or twice, when I joined a gym for a brief period. And and if it's a really good gym, the first thing they do is not just take your money and point you in the direction of the treadmill or whatever. Somebody will sit down with you and say, tell me your story. Tell me what you've tried in the past. Tell me what's worked, what hasn't worked. Tell me where you are right now. Tell me something. So they'll know best how to deal with you and create a plan that works well for you. It's amazing how many guys go to a church that needs to be revitalized. There's a handful of older elderly members that have been there a long time, and they never take the time to sit down one-on-one and do a very simple examination of where they've been, what they've been through, what the good times have been, the bad times have been. I remember Mark Halleck. He has replanted the church in Englewood, Colorado. And when he went there, Calvary had about 30 people remaining. Today, it's multiple hundreds of folks and doing a great job. But it began to grow rather rapidly. But it was always like two churches. There was the older church and then the growing new church. And they were like kind of Velcroed together, but not really one. And it really bothered him. And I remember he said it took a lot of effort for him to do this. The older people were pretty resistant to it, but he convinced them to actually go away for a retreat. And so a lot of the older people actually agreed to go, and the younger people went. and they spent a weekend together. And basically, it was a time for the older members to tell those younger members their story. And,
Oh,
and after that happened, this sweet fellowship began to emerge because the older members were listened to, and the younger members heard the pain, the joy, the sorrows, the struggles, and there was some ownership of that history. And I just think we overlook that way too many times. And so I believe that's exactly where you start, is to sit down and ask them their story, how they came to know Jesus, how long they've been there, and the other questions like that.
well, we're going to provide a guide, not an
Oh,
exhaustive
great.
guide. We're going to
Oh,
provide a guide.
I'm glad I tuned in. This is going to be fun. All right, good.
And contrary to the previous podcast that we tried to record in 5 takes with technical problems, we're going to do this one in 1 take, Mark.
There you
And we're
go.
going to go through what are some possible questions that you can ask these longer term members. One of them, what are some of the greatest days of the church and why do you consider them great? Oh,
Yep.
that's a good one.
Yeah, start with the good stuff. Don't start with the bad stuff. When we sit down with the church and consult with them or talk to them that are going through some difficulties, I never want to start with what are your main problems. I mean, that gets the whole thing off. Tell me about a time God did some amazing things in your life and some amazing things in the life of this church. I want to hear those stories because I'm sure he did. And sometimes they'll say, well, I don't know of any. You say, well, maybe it's not since you've been here, but I bet you heard something about this church in its past. And eventually they'll start telling you of a time when there were some amazing things that took place. And so, find out where God has been at work in that place somewhere in the past and let them relish that story and enjoy that story and remember that story. Let's begin with that for sure is a really
And Mark,
important
if they
place.
cannot think of something corporately, you can make a slight pivot in the question. Tell us somehow how this church, since you've been here, has ministered to you.
Right.
Tell us why you're here and what God has done in this church for you personally. So
Right.
you can personalize it. If you
Yeah,
can't
what it
get the
means to
corporate
you.
story.
Yeah, has there been a time in your life? I remember talking to a widow, and she said it was a small church, a struggling church, and I asked that very question, and she said, "I remember the night my husband passed away, and I had to come home from the hospital, and after he'd passed away, and she said my pastor and his wife were at my house, and she said they sat up with me all night long." And she said, I've never forgotten that. And so her love for the church, for that church, was really connected to that very important moment in her life when she needed something desperately, and the pastor and his wife were there with her. And those kinds of things to help them bring that back to their mind and their heart, to get them thinking of the good things God has done in that church in the past.
Another possible question is, can you tell us a time when the church took a step of faith and got out of his comfort zone? God, that can have all kind of implications. One, you're listening again, as we've indicated. Two, you're hearing a story about the church that you may not know, and it may encourage you. Three, you're reminding the member that there was a time that they got out of their comfort zone. It may be time to do it again.
And it was a good time, right? Something good happened when they got out of their
At
comfort
least
zone.
in hindsight, it was a good time.
Yeah. Let me give you another real example of that. A church that was really struggling and closure was very much on the horizon, and I brought up that question, and without hesitation, they said, "Oh yeah, man, we remember back in 1974, 75, we bought a bunch of old buses and we painted them up and we started a bus ministry. We didn't know what we were doing, and we had to go out every Saturday and go door to door, and we had to do children's church on Sunday. We'd never done that before, and the church grew and so you begin to talk to them about, well, what kind of sacrifices did you have to make in order to do that? Oh, they make a lot of sacrifices. They had to get up every Saturday. The men and the women who worked in bus ministry had to give up every single Saturday morning. They didn't get home until late on Sunday, afternoon, because they had to take the kids home. They had to get there early on Sunday morning because they had to get the buses started, especially in the winter. They had to keep those buses running. They had to take turns in children's church, and it's like all of a sudden, as they're talking, they're realizing that took a lot of work. That was a lot of effort. It's like, yeah, that's what ministry is. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort. And so, but they realize, they look back at that as one of the highlights of the church life, because not only the numbers of people that came, but the numbers of children that came to know Jesus and the ministry they had in people's families. So that was a recent experience I had with the church who really relived the 40 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever it was, early 1970s bus ministry. And it was a time they got out of their comfort zone, and God really blessed them.
That's an incredible story. Presuming that you're talking to older people like Mark Clifton and Thom Rainer, and you're interviewing them, you might want to begin to talk to them about the future of the church related to their family members, maybe their children, but maybe their grandchildren, or maybe even their great grandchildren. And you ask this question: what do you think would need to happen in this church to attract your grandchildren or your great grandchildren? I wonder where that would go with some of the older members.
And to talk about Linwood, the little church that I'm privileged to be leading. When we went there right after COVID, or during COVID, actually, there were 3 remaining members, a husband and a wife and another lady. And the husband and wife were an older couple. And we replanted that church. God replanted it, and it's doing really well. But the very first baptism in that replanted church was the granddaughter of the older couple. It was their granddaughter. And Thom, the changes we made in that church, you can't even begin to imagine. I mean, interior of that church has been completely ripped out, completely redone. There's nothing recognizable about the interior of that church really at all, hardly. And the exterior, we've redone that. And of course, the programming, we've done all of that. And the happiest people about all that is that older couple, because, hey, our granddaughter got baptized, and we've reached this next generation. I've told this story, I think, before, but Jill and I are empty nesters, and we don't cook a lot at our house. We're trying. I got a grill, and we tried to cook steaks last night, but let's be frank.
What is that like to have someone
I don't know.
cook?
They taste a lot better when you go out to eat. That's all I know. But anyway. You told me one time that the only reason you have a kitchen at your house is it came with the house. You told me that. You said that.
Actually, that's my wife who got that sign.
Okay.
It's just a reminder of her priorities, where cooking is not.
All right. Well, it's just the 2 of us, and she works, and I do whatever it is I do. I'm not sure what it is, but she has a real job. And so she'll get off work and she'll text me sometimes, and she'll say, "Hey, you want to meet me someplace?" And we'll meet at, we're not millennials, so we don't go to these out of the wall foodie places. We meet at Bob Evans or Cracker Barrel, or if we want to be really out there on the edge.
Those are God's solid restaurants.
If we want to get really on the edge, we'll go to Panera. But there is never a time that when Jill texts me on the way home from work and says, "Where do you want to go?" There's never a time I say, "I want to go to CC's Pizza or Chuck E. Cheese Pizza." I've just never said that because it's like the worst pizza in the world. If you go to Chuck E. Cheese,
if you like to chew rubber, it's okay.
And it's just, and all the kids are in there and they're making all the noise and they're playing in the ball pit and they have their shoes off and it smells like socks. And, I don't want to go there. However, we have 4 grandsons, right? So if one of my daughter-in-laws or my sons text me during the day and say, "Hey, we're going to be at Chuck E. Cheese tonight," I mean, you couldn't stop Jill and I from going to Chuck E. Cheese. It's the one place in all of the city we want to be that night. And it's the most beautiful, wonderful place in the world because our grandchildren are there. And so I've had that discussion with older church members before, that what makes you love it is what's happening with the children and the young people who are there, not necessarily the stuff that's going on around. You would probably do it differently. But when you can have that kind of attachment and love for people, love for young generation, the next generation, willing to do whatever it takes to spend time with them, to be with them, to see them come to know Christ, that's where your real joy is found. It's not found in doing just what you want to do. It would just be ridiculous for Jill and I to say, "Well, I know the boys are going to be there and we'd like to see our grandsons, but we just don't like that place. We're going to go ahead and stop at Bob Evans and not see the grandsons." That's kind of what people, that's kind of what older people do in a church when they say, "We just don't want to make changes." And at the end of the day, young people don't come hang out at your church. They really don't. And it's a real tragedy for sure.
I got a Chuck E. Cheese story. I'll try to be quick, Mark.
All right.
11 grandkids. The first Chuck E. Cheese visit was with my oldest grandchild, Cannon. It was his first Chuck E. Cheese visit. It's a big deal. He loved going to the games and getting the tickets. He was having this great time. He was young. He was really young, but 5, 6, it doesn't matter. but I did not anticipate what would happen. I was with him the whole time, walking around with him. The parents trusted me for some reason, and we're walking around in Chuck E. Cheese. Chuck E. Cheese himself came out.
Wow.
Freaked out my grandson. He did not expect a 6'2" rat to come up to him. And he freaked out. And the rat, Chuck E. Cheese, tried to overcompensate by patting him on the back and hugging him, which was causing him to freak out more. And, I kept saying, you need to step back, you need to step back. And finally I yelled at him. I said, listen, if you don't get away from my grandson, you're going to be one dead rat. And he finally moved away. That was my first Chuck E. Cheese story. He was traumatized, but we went on and had some rubber-based pizza, and
there you go.
And we were okay in that. I love that question though. What would happen? What would need to happen to the church to attract your grandchildren, and maybe in these days with multiple generations, your great-grandchildren?
Right.
Here's a related one. This is close. What would it take for this church to become more evangelistic, to reach people with the gospel who aren't Christians? I mean, I don't know that I've ever asked that of an older generation in a revitalization, but it's intriguing.
I think sometimes the older generation is fearful of the world as it is now, a little bit angst about the world as it is now, rather than, and this is an oversimplification, overstatement, but I in my experience, the world as it is now is so different than the world that they were familiar with, that they spend more time sort of wishing it were different and longing for it to be like it used to be and fearful of it than they do broken over it and compassionate for it. And I think there has to be a change, and you have to get to the place that you're not just fearful of the world or angst over the world, but you're broken for the world. And we say all the time, you go to a dying church and you say, what do you need? And they always say, well, we don't have any young people. Well, how would that be fixed? And invariably they say, well, we need a youth program.
Yeah, and get a youth minister. He'll fix it.
Yeah, the last thing a dying church needs is a youth program and a youth minister, because the dying church needs to become compassionate and broken over the young people who live in their community, even those they don't know. When they see on the news young people that did some terrible things, that looted something or robbed something or got in trouble at school, rather than to feel fearful and angry about that, do you take that moment and just pray for them and pray for your community and have deep compassion on them? A program doesn't make you change your heart. It doesn't make you change your agenda. And yet that's what needs to happen. And so I think when you talk about evangelism, it begins with compassion. It begins with a real hurt for a broken world. And I think sometimes as older folks, we just get tired of change. We get tired of we just wish everything would be the same, or we just wish Jesus come back and change it all. I mean, someone once said that when James and John wanted to call down fire from heaven, we're pretty harsh on them about that. You think, where did that come from? Actually, it's from the Old Testament, but they wanted to call down fire from heaven and burn up the enemies. Oh, that's terrible. Well, sometimes when we say, man, I just wish Jesus would come back and take us home and burn this whole place up, we're saying the same things James and John did. We're just saying it differently. And rather than to have compassion.
There's going to be some who are, to use a phrase that hadn't been used in a long time, left behind.
That's right. That's right. Two men walking up a hill.
Yes.
You remember that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. What is that? Two men walking up a hill. One disappears and one's left standing still. I wish we'd all been ready.
Yes.
I mean, keep going. I know the whole song. I'll stop. Yeah. We'll have to pay royalties if I keep singing it.
I'll pay you to stop singing if you need me to do
that. But yes, I think we have to get to the fact that dying churches are not evangelistic. Now, it doesn't mean they don't like evangelism. It doesn't mean they don't want people to know Jesus. It just means I don't think that when they get together for prayer meeting, what do they spend the majority of their time praying on? Is it the sick and afflicted?
Yes.
Or even if it's the lost, okay, you're praying for the lost in the community. All right. But you remember what Paul asked for when he wanted people to pray for him. He said, pray that I be bold in my witness. Well, if the Apostle Paul needs to be bold prayer to be bold in his witness, we probably do too. Take me to a prayer meeting where the remaining elderly members of that church pray with passion that they would become bold witnesses for Jesus in their neighborhood. And that's a church that'll start being evangelistic.
I love that. We're talking about questions that you can ask long-term members in a revitalization. Question number 1, what are some of the greatest days in the church and why do you consider them great? Question number 2, when did the church take a step of faith and took it out of its comfort zone? Number 3, what would need to happen to this church to attract your grandchildren or great-grandchildren? Somewhat related, what would it take for this church to become more evangelistic? And then finally, you're asking them a question about themselves. What has kept you at this church for so many years? What do you think they'll say, Mark?
Probably friendships, relationships, a sense of obligation, keeping it open, things like that.
And maybe they'll say something like reaching the community. Maybe they'll stumble and say, "Oh, I didn't really mean that."
Yeah, I don't. That if that comes out, and I mean this in all kindness, I'm just telling you what I've heard in my experience. If that does come out, it's a second or third level thing. It's almost as if apologetically I need to throw that in there.
Yep.
Because if a church has been in decline for a number of years and they've been there for a long time and you say, why are you staying here? Generally speaking, it's because I have friends relationship. I've just been coming here for a long time. I feel obligated to be here. I feel like it needs me. Generally, it's not the first thing out of their mouth is, man, I love the people in this neighborhood and I want them to see Jesus. I'm not saying they don't think that, but that's often, I'm just telling you, that's often not where they're wired up at primarily. Whereas if you go to a brand new church, plant, right? And it's only been going for 6 or 9 months. And you ask some of the people, why are you here? They're going to tell you, we're here to reach this community. We're here to, this is our passion. They know what that's about because that's the only reason they'd be there. So I think that's quite a telling kind of thing too. So
I do hope this has been helpful. I've loved reviewing these 5 questions. This is not an exhaustive list of questions that you can ask long-term members, but Mark has really given us a lot to think about as we've gone through each of these. And maybe that's what you need to do in some of your revitalizations. Just take some time, start talking to some of these long-term members, or even better, start listening to some of these long-term members. And maybe you'll learn something, and maybe they'll think of something that will even surprise them in the course of these conversations. Thank you for being a part of Revitalize and Replant. Mark Clifton and Kevin Ezell and I are here every single week. We love sharing these things with you. We love talking about this whole area of revitalizing and replanting. We're always grateful to the North American Mission Board for allowing us to be here as a part of this ministry. Keep on tuning in to Revitalize and Replant, and we'll see you in the next episode.